Today I want to talk about the chop saw or the miter saw. But before we do that, we need to talk about shop safety. The first thing that you need to do is remove any jewelry. You also need to tie back long hair, secure any loose clothing, be sure you're wearing closed-toed shoes, and most importantly, be wearing safety glasses. The miter saw in our shop is what's known as a sliding compound miter saw. It slides in and out and will cut out to a piece that's 14 inches. Now, a miter saw, miter is a term for angle. So it is designed to cut angles, and it is a compound miter saw, in that you can angle it this side, you can angle it the other side, but you can also tilt the blade to cut a compound angle. Now, this isn't a real common cut, and if you are attempting to cut something at a compound angle, please let the instructor know. Now, before you start cutting on the miter saw, the first thing that you need to do is actually mark what you plan on cutting. Mark the line. Now, the miter saw can cut very, very accurate pieces, but it also depends on how accurate you are drawing your line. So it can cut anywhere. If you need to shave the end of a board off right here, it'll do that. If you want to cut a 6-inch piece, you simply mark 6 inches. Now, just as a matter of practice for myself, I always put an X on the side of the line where I want the saw blade to go. On a 6-inch piece, it should be pretty obvious it's from the end of the board, but occasionally you're cutting boards that are almost in half, and if you spin that piece around, you might lose track of which end you want to cut off. So, just as a matter of good practice, I always put the X here. Now, it's also, I find, important to talk about pencils. I prefer to use a mechanical pencil when I'm in the shop because the line is a constant width. You can use any wooden pencil because it's much easier to get rid of the line it erases as opposed to a pen. But if you're using something like a Sharpie where that line is, you know, somewhere between a 32nd and an 1/8 of an inch, it's really hard to get accurate, clean cuts. So it's always good practice. Use a pencil and make your line as thin as possible. And then know that as you're cutting, you are trying to leave this line. And the reason for that is the saw blade on here is an 1/8 of an inch wide. If you look at that, the teeth here are an 1/8 of an inch. So as you cut, that eats an 1/8 of an inch of material. Now, if you mark it in the middle, sometimes when you bring the saw blade down, you can't see it. You may need to use a combination square in order to line that up a little bit better, so that when you slide it in, you can see where you're cutting. So as we take this and slide it into the chop saw, you can see we can line this up, and I'm going to put the saw on the opposite, or I'm going to put the line on the opposite side of the saw blade, so that as I cut, I'm cutting off the piece that I want and keeping the correct length. Now, as you slide pieces into the miter saw, there's certain things that you need to consider. First off, it always needs to be against this fence, okay, one part or the other, and you always want to keep your hand at least 6 inches away. There's a red no hand spot here. If your hand is closer than that, you need to move it sideways or get a different piece to cut things off of. If it's closer than 6 inches, because of the size of this blade, it's very easy to remove one of your fingers. So as you're keeping it square against the fence, you also need to make sure that you're keeping it flat on the table. If it bows up or it's warped and stays away from that, move your piece around. These flip back and forth. You can slide it in, change your angle. So as you're setting this up, pay very close attention to how it sits across the table and how it sits against the fence back here. Once you have your piece aligned where you want it, the next thing to talk about is your hand position. This saw is ambidextrous. It meaning you can run it with either your right hand or your left hand. But as you're setting up to cut, you never want to cross your arms and be holding it this way or this way. The reason is if that kicks back, there's a likelihood that that saw will contact your arm. Okay, so you can hold it with your right hand, hold the piece with your left. You're going to use your left or your right thumb to push the red button in, and then underneath there's a black trigger switch. You have to put both of them in together. Once you have your hands in position, the next thing to do is to bring the saw closest to you, the operator, and bring it down so it's within about an inch. If you have it touching when you turn it on, it's going to rip a big chunk off the corner. Also, if you start it in the middle and pull it at yourself, because of the rotation of the saw, it spins this way. If you put it down and pull, the saw has a tendency to run. So if you bring it closest to you, the operator, on this outside edge of the board, push down and push through, you have better control over using the chop saw. So we'll bring this out, start it about here, push the red trigger switch in, pull the black button. It does tend to jump a little bit. Push down. Now, I always get in the habit of letting the saw blade stop in the down position. If you bring it up while it's still moving, there's a likelihood, especially if you have really little pieces or you're using a stop, which is something we'll talk about in another video, those pieces can catch, they get caught, and they can fly off and hurt somebody. Cutting an angle on the chop saw is very much like making a straight cut. There's some subtle things that you have to do first. Step number one, loosen the lock knob in front. There's a trigger switch underneath that you need to lift up, and then you just rotate it to the angle that you want to cut it at. For today, we're going to use a 45-degree angle. The degrees are printed on a gauge right here. There's a red line that corresponds it, and all the common angles have stops so that as soon as you let it go, you can push it sideways and you can hear it lock into place. Tighten the knob up right here. The table is set. Next, you slide your piece over, and again, bring it down so you can see where the line is. Line it up so the teeth of the saw are on the opposite side of the piece that you're keeping. You'll bring it out towards the operator. Again, hands 6 inches away. You'll come down and all the way through. And again, to start it, push the red button in, pull the black trigger. Down and through. You notice that I was a little bit not far enough out. I did have to pull it. You could see the saw kind of run. If you do, you just need to be aware that it takes a little bit more control, but it's always best to start out here and push your way through. When you are finished using the chop saw, loosen the knob, put it back to 0. And just as a matter of practice, before you start and you want to make a straight cut, make sure that it is actually at 0. If occasionally 2 degrees, you have to cut something at 1 or 2 degrees. If you're not paying attention, 2 degrees is very hard to tell from 0 degrees. So always double check that it's at 90 degrees. There's a lot of people that use the shop during the course of a day, and it may or may not be exactly where you want it. But when you're finished, put it back to 0, take the piece that you want to keep, go about your business, take the extra piece, and this piece goes back in the wood room. You can then take a brush, sweep this off. The dust collector will be on to pull the sawdust out.